Do you want to learn more on how to put money to work in regenerative food and agriculture? Follow our video course via investinginregenerativeagriculture.com/course or in the links below. Now, on to the podcast. Why is a $15 billion food company investing heavily in regenerative agriculture? Find out in this interview with Chief Sustainability and Social Impact Officer of General Mills. Welcome to another episode of Investing in Regenerative Agriculture, Investing as if the Planet Mattered, a podcast show where I talk to the pioneers in the regenerative food and agriculture space to learn more on how to put our money to work to regenerate soil, people, local communities and ecosystems while making an appropriate and fair return. Why my focus on soil and regeneration? Because so many of the pressing issues we face today have their roots in how we treat our land, grow our food and what we eat. And it's time that we as investors, big and small, and consumers start paying much more attention to the dirt/soil underneath our feet. Before we get started, I've been recording these interviews next to my day job, and I will definitely continue to do so and release about an episode a month. But at the same time, I would love to take this further, share more interviews. There are many more stories to share on investing in regenerative food and agriculture. More depth, improve the quality, maybe even doing some video series. So I started a Patreon community, which makes it easy to support creators like myself. If these podcasts have been of value to you, and if you have the means, I invite you to support me and make this happen. For more information, please find the link to my Patreon account in the description below. And now, without further ado, the interview. Enjoy! Welcome to a new podcast. I'm Koen van Seijen, your host. On the podcast today, I've married Jane Melendez, Chief Sustainability and Social Impact Officer at General Mills, one of the main food companies in the world. Welcome, Mary Jane.
Thank you for having me. It's my pleasure to be here.
And to start with a personal question, what brings you to soil? What brings General Mills to soil? And what brings you to regenerative agriculture?
So this has been a bit of a journey for General Mills, and we actually arrived at regenerative agriculture through climate change. So we made a commitment to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions by 28% by the year 2025. And when we made that commitment, one of the things that we realized pretty early on was the power of soil to sequester carbon. And the more we got into soil health, the more we started learning about regenerative agriculture. And that really opened up, I think, a new way of thinking for us in terms of how we could go beyond simply meeting these goals to actually looking at a practice that could be carbon positive for the planet. So it was a bit of a journey, but we started through climate change.
And when that realization came, what was the first, because you work at a very big company, what was the first angle that you took to address that? So how did you start integrating that into, I imagine, some pieces of the business, not all the pieces at the same time?
Right. You're exactly right. And actually I should back up to when this first started. It was actually in about 2015 at COP21. We had joined one of our NGO partners, the Nature Conservancy, and General Mills brought with us some producers who were part of this field to market initiative, and they came to Paris to talk about the importance of soil health for farmers. And that's where we first really started to, I would say, get schooled on the power of soil health. And General Mills came out of that convening thinking, boy, we really have an opportunity to learn more about this. So we hadn't really played in soil health before that. And coming out of COP21, we partnered with the Nature Conservancy and the Soil Health Partnership, and we actually created the Soil Health Roadmap, which is essentially a roadmap around policy and practices for producers to help return health to the soil. And it was really interesting to see what benefits the producers were starting to see once they brought in some of those practices. And then as we started to talk to more producers, we call them Renaissance producers. They're farmers who are using farming techniques that were, used on the planet for hundreds of years, but just not in the last century. And we thought, wow, this is really incredible when you talk about the difference that these producers are seeing within their own farms or their own operations. We saw increased profitability for the producers. They were seeing incredible increases in soil health. and they were seeing biodiversity return to their land, both above ground, so animals and insects and rodents coming back onto the land, and then below ground, when they looked at their soil, they were seeing a completely different way that the soil was behaving after these practices were applied. And as General Mills explored these more and more, we thought, gosh, this is a really powerful lever that we can pull, because regenerative agriculture not only does all those things for the farmers, but it allows farmers to have smaller carbon footprints. And I'll share with you shortly an example that we've seen here in the US with one of our producers who is raising beef for our Epic Provisions brand. The farmers were seeing better use of water quality, more water quantity. Their soil could hold more water. And if you looked back at where General Mills was investing within sustainability before regenerative agriculture, we had an investment stream going into support soil health initiatives. We were investing to improve pollinator health and habitat restoration. We were investing to support livelihoods of smallholder farmers. And we were investing in watersheds, in particular, those watersheds that are important to our supply chain. But when you flip this on its head and you look at regenerative agriculture, this one intervention touches on all of those pieces. And I think that for us was the aha moment in the power of these practices. And we're finding the magic really happens when producers are stacking these practices on top of one another, that it was resulting in higher carbon levels in the soil, which in turn will help us to get to our overall goal of reducing our greenhouse gas emissions and getting to sustainable emissions over time. And this is something that has the power to get us to net positive. So that was part of our journey. And then what we also did is over the past year, our chief sustainability officer convened a group internally to start exploring how do we take this back into our supply chain? So how do we operationalize this practice by taking our suppliers back to farm level?
Because just to be clear, sorry to interrupt, but you don't own any land. You always work with your farmers, with your growers, with your producers, but it's not your land.
That's correct. And actually, if you look at the way that General Mills purchases many of our ingredients, we are not buying direct for farmers. Our farmers, for example, the farmers who are growing oats for what we use in Cheerios and Nature Valley and Cascadian Farm, those farmers are selling their oats into supply sheds, so big sheds of oats. So we don't directly have invoices that we're cutting to farmers. We're using suppliers who are aggregating those commodities or those ingredients into supply sheds. So that's the reason that we wanted to really engage our suppliers in this process, because we needed to have them along on the journey to understand. We wanted them to see firsthand the power of regenerative agriculture at the farm level. And so we're doing this in partnership with our suppliers and with our farmers. And we're starting right now with the farmers who are in our oats, who work within our oats supply chain. So General Mills buys, I think we're one of the largest purchasers of oats in the world, just because we have brands that utilize so much of that key ingredient. And we buy most of our oats from a few areas in Canada and then North and South Dakota. And what we did is we thought, could we get farmers interested? Would there be interest from the farmers to take part in training around regenerative agriculture? And could we provide them some technical assistance? So what we did is we worked with some Renaissance farmers like Gabe Brown, Ray Archuleta, and engaged them to say, would you be willing to provide this training to the farmers and to these producers? General Mills is funding it all, so there's no money that the farmers are having to invest in this practice. We're simply providing the training. And what we had hoped is to, in the first year, engage about 25 producers, and we hope to have about 10,000 acres of oats in the pilot. So it would basically be a pilot that would move from conventional or traditional practices, implement regenerative agriculture practices over time. And then what we wanted to do is really measure. We have an outcomes focused through this whole approach. And what we're hoping for, there's really three things that we're measuring and looking to see on these acres of regenerative land. So we expect to see farmer profitability increase. And we believe that that should happen because when you stack these principles one on top of the other, you don't need as many inputs for your land. So that's one piece that we expected to see that the profitability to the farmers go up. Again, we expected to see soil health improve. So as you're implementing some of these regenerative practices, and those practices are minimal soil disturbance, maximizing the crop diversity, so not just a monoculture, but really bringing in different types of crops onto the land, keeping the soil covered, so thinking about utilizing more cover crops on these lands to ensure that you're protecting the soil from erosion, maintaining a living root year-round is also really important for what that does in terms of bringing carbon and nutrients into the root systems and into the soils, and really feeding that microbiome within the soil. And finally, the integration of livestock. So these are the principles that these farmers are now learning through this group, Understanding Ag. That's the partner that is actually delivering the trainings and the technical assistant to these farmers. And we were so pleasantly surprised. In the first year, we have about 45 farmers.
It's almost double what you expected. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. And we were so surprised and delighted by the interest that we saw from the farmers. And we have 50,000 acres of farmland that's going to be part of this as well. So we were really excited about the interest, the genuine interest that the farmers and their families had in wanting to better understand these practices. And what I really appreciate about the training is that the farmers are getting 2-day intensive training 2 times per year on the principles of regenerative agriculture and really understanding how they can start transitioning to these new practices. In addition, they get one-on-one training with experienced producers, and it's equivalent to a full workday per month. And they're doing things like helping the farmers with their crop plans for the next year, or walking them through how to plant cover crops into a no-till situation, or to say, now that you've implemented some of these practices, how do you look at what nutrients or inputs you can start pulling back on? So they're providing answers to really practical questions for, a farmer who is not farmed this way is obviously you're not going to know tomorrow how to do this. So I just really appreciate that one-on-one technical assistance. So the farmer continues to have support along the journey.
And what are you mentioned you're focused on outcomes instead of the process. What are you measuring in this pilot? I mean, it's a huge pilot, but what are you measuring in this pilot? Soil carbon? Are you measuring nutrient density? What is the angle? What you're looking for in terms of oat in this case?
Sure. So a couple of different things. So yes, we will be measuring the carbon in the soil. So before the pilot started, we'll take a measurement of the soil. After, we'll look at that as well. So we're looking at what's the nutrient density within the soil, how much carbon is in the soil before the practices were implemented versus what we see a year or 2, 3 years down the road. It's really interesting, they're doing scans of biodiversity both above and below ground. So they'll look at what microbes are in the soil beforehand, but they're also doing things like they will do insect scanning and bird scanning. So again, new things that I'm learning about, but they'll actually look at what types of biodiversity are coming back to the land once these practices have been implemented. So to be able to see that screenshot beforehand, and then, a year to 3 years into that will be really interesting for us. We think we're going to see those changes. And what we're really excited about is actually having focused measurement to be able to speak to these outcomes over time. And then, of course, we'll look at farmer profitability and how has spend within inputs changed over that time. What are you not spending money on? And maybe how have you, they're obviously going to have to make other investments in things like cover crops, but how are they balancing that relative to their profitability for their operations?
Yeah, which seems to be, I just had a discussion on that today. Most farmers probably want to leave the land in a better shape to the next generation, which in many cases, many farmers around the world are getting to an age where they definitely have to think about that. And in many cases, the younger generation, especially if you're farming traditionally, conventionally, chemically, is not really ready to come back.
Right.
Why? Because the profitability doesn't seem to be there. And then if you look at operations like Gabe Brown, it suddenly becomes a whole different story. That's why it seems to be like nutrient density in healthcare is so important with consumers. Profitability obviously is so important with farmers, because otherwise they're not going to be there the years after, and the next generation won't come back at all.
You're absolutely right. And what has also been really eye-opening is to see, we have several examples of these photos that show a traditionally farmed piece of land and a farmer who's using regenerative practices on their land. And when you see them side by side, there's a photo that sticks in my memory, and it's one that was taken in Oklahoma after about a 5.5-inch rainfall. And you see one, farm, the one that has been more traditionally farmed, that is just completely underwater. And you think, how is that farmer going to be able to do anything to the land? The water is just sitting there. And then you look across the street at the farmer who has been using these regenerative practices, and the land has completely absorbed that, and the soil is holding that water. And that farmer can get out and go out and start working in the land that day. And to see those photos and those examples over and over again, I think for us have been such a powerful demonstration of what these practices can do for the land. And not, it's not like we have to take decades to do this. Yes, it will take years, but it's really interesting when you see the difference in how the land is so much more resilient through these practices. And for us, that's so important because with climate change and with, more severe swings in weather patterns, we need to ensure that we are building a resilient supply chain for General Mills, not just for today, but for generations to come. So I feel like that's where farmers and, at least this food company thinks more generationally about the natural resources that we are stewarding, that we are purchasing, the relationships that we're building with these farmers is not just for this quarter or for this year. We want to ensure that we have, a solid supply of oats for our products for the long term. And I think that regenerative agriculture is a very powerful answer to that. As you look at declining natural resources and climate change on the rise, we have to figure out how we can de-risk some of these supply chains that are so important to us.
Yeah, and I think it's a perfect year to see that, because I keep hearing stories actually from both sides of the pond of a very, very, very wet spring, and many places actually haven't planted yet, and it's now the beginning of June. So that's going to be an issue. And I don't know if you've seen in your farmers or the farmers you work with or indirectly buy from, if the regenerative ones or the Renaissance ones that are the front runners, if they have been suffering less in this, or is that something we will see over the next years?
I think it's something that we will see. I was with a group last week that was talking about the farmers that they had just come back from visiting, and normally they would be planting in early May, and we're a month behind already here in the U.S. And when you fly over, you do see farms that have water sitting on them. So you can't even get out and work that land right now because the soil is not taking in any of that water. And I think when you're in an airplane and you're flying over the Midwest and you see that, it's a very stark reality that we have to do things differently because we are not going to be able to feed a growing population with these practices. So I just think for us, it's such an important lever for us to be able to pull, and we're excited to learn from this initial pilot and then see how we can think about taking this into other key ingredients that we're purchasing, like wheat, like sugar beets. So I think there's a lot of opportunities for us to explore, what's next as well.
And because there's a lot of news coming out around regenerative agriculture, and actually your company, your work with the Saber Institute, the climate positive beef, the life cycle assessment that just came out, I think 2 or 3 weeks ago with Qantas, like you're doing a lot. What is the role as a big food company that actually doesn't own land directly? How do you see that going from these pilots to a bigger movement and to actually getting closer to those goals of many, many, many acres towards regenerative? What do you see there as the speed up basically that seems to be happening, or at least on the news side, because I see so much coming out?
I think because, again, we're dealing with such severe weather or extreme swings in weather, and we're realizing that, we're a company whose health and wellness depends completely on Mother Nature. So if Mother Nature is not having a good year and we can't get the output of Mother Nature to put into our ingredients, we're in a really difficult spot. And I think people are making that connection more powerfully and more quickly today than I think historically than they have. And one of the reasons that we've looked at so many different ways to try to, advance sustainability and now regenerative practices through our work is we have to really look at de-risking supply chain risk for the company and thinking about how do we ensure a steady, healthy stream of ingredients that General Mills can continue to purchase year after year. And one of the things that we've been doing over the last, I would say 3 to 5 years, is looking at a number of different areas. We didn't really have kind of a silver bullet. And I think regenerative agriculture is for us becoming more and more of that element. But we did things like, we were looking at planting 100,000 acres of pollinator habitat across the U.S. to try to bring back more pollinators to areas where there were large farms, or looking at this life cycle assessment from white oak pastures in Bluffton, Georgia, and to see actually that we have a farmer who is literally sequestering more carbon within his operations than his whole farm operation is putting out. That was a really surprising moment for us, and I think even for the farmer. And I think it just goes to show we have a lot more understanding and learning to do with Mother Nature. I think her intelligence sometimes surpasses our own. And so there's an opportunity for us to study that, I think, a little more closely and look at, gosh, when you're bringing back these ecosystems and you're so thoughtful about treating the farm as a whole ecosystem versus as a monoculture or, just growing 1 or 2 ingredients, what the power of that ecosystem and the harmony that happens above and below ground with these practices for us has been really compelling. And I think, we're also at a point where you look at greenhouse gas emissions and how quickly we need to start moving, the needle on this so we're not creating irreparable damage to our planet. And I think, again, with what regenerative agriculture can do in terms of water, soil, carbon sequestration, farmer livelihoods, it's just such a powerful lever for us to be able to bring forward. And we hope that we can take this to more of our ingredients over time, because I think that will help us to really get to a truly not even sustainable, but more regenerative supply chain.
And what do you see as the biggest, let's say 2, because maybe you have a whole list, barriers to make regenerative agriculture and food on a broader scale, scalable or economically viable? What are the 2 biggest barriers for this sector to really, really grow?
So I would say one that we're seeing right now is literally capacity for getting this training and technical assistance out to more and more farmers who are interested and who are opting themselves to learn more about this. I mentioned that we had, double the amount of farmers in the pilot this year than we had even thought we would get in year 1. And our partners who are delivering this training and technical assistance are literally at capacity. We can't take any more farmers in at this time. So we're trying to think about creative ways to unlock that capacity to be able to provide training to more farmers who are interested in learning about that. So I think that's one piece. And then, also the other piece that I think, in all honesty, it's a mindset shift and it's a cultural shift. It's not the way that we have been farming, at least, in North America and other parts of the world for a long time. So you're going against, practices, conventional practices and education that current farmers, have farmed that way, maybe their fathers, maybe their grandfathers. So to help them through that mindset shift and to understand that they have a community supporting them, I think is an opportunity for us to continue to be intentional about that and understanding the support the farmers need as they make these transitions. Because it's not easy when you're on the tip of a spear of leading this kind of change. Sometimes that can be a very lonely place.
Yeah, you don't want to be the farmer. I've had this discussion actually many times on the podcast, that you don't want to be the farmer that, first of all, changes everything, meaning that their father, grandfather, etc. did things wrong, which is not true, but that seems to be the case when you start even going organic, or your fields are more messy when you put in cover crops, etc. But it also means that all your neighbors are doing something wrong, between brackets, and you don't want to be the one that walks into the local bar or the coffee place and everybody shuts up basically because they're looking at you because you're the weirdo in town. Luckily, they're getting more and more, but as you are a pioneer, that's a very, very difficult peer pressure role that you're in, and not many are obviously able or willing to go there.
You are exactly right. And I think we have to change the narrative there. And I think we also have to change the narrative on farmers. I mean, farmers have the potential to not only feed, but to save the world. There's not many other places or, heads, hearts, and hands that can literally help to rebuild the soil. And we need that because we've lost, 100 centimeters, 50% of the world's topsoil over the last 150 years. And
they're the rock stars of our time. Yeah.
Right. That's exactly right. And they should be, I just think that society owes that to them because they're feeding most of the world and they're helping to heal it at the same time.
I absolutely agree. I think we don't pay enough attention to the dirt/soil under our feet, and we for sure don't pay enough attention to the people that are working it day and night, sometimes by hand, depending where you are, sometimes big combines and tractors, but their livelihood and our livelihood depends on that.
You're exactly right.
Let's switch gears a bit to the finance side of things. I see a lot of interest from family offices, from investors, big and small. Actually, I get requests quite often of, okay, it's great you're doing this podcast, but how can I put my money to work? And obviously, I cannot give investment advice, but as a big company, you're moving into this space. What should smart investors look out for? What should they be? Where should they read? What questions should they ask in terms of getting active in regenerative agriculture and food?
I would say a couple of things. One, there is work underway to stand up an ecosystem services market. So I would say watch for that. And I think that's really important because today, food and ag contributes to roughly a third of all carbon emissions, but it only receives about 2% of global investments to address climate change. And I think that's even more shocking when you realize that unlike an investment in clean energy, which is very, very important, and General Mills has made many of those investments, it only makes the industry carbon neutral, whereas agriculture actually has the potential to be carbon positive. So agriculture could actually take in more carbon than it produces. And it's for that very reason that General Mills has made such a significant investment and that we want to remain a leader in this space. So I would challenge some of these impact investors to, in addition to looking at what you can invest in through clean energy, look at regenerative agriculture as an option to, not only help some of these farmers transition to make that switch and to help bring the practices to more farmland, but to at the same time be attentive to what that can do for climate in terms of the sequestration, in terms of the soil health, because that is a powerful story when you look at the total return on that investment, not just in terms of your, return on with cash, but the return that you're getting out of from Mother Nature.
Is there a role in terms of private investors? And you mentioned helping farmers to go through the transition. I think one role could be to help more teachers and trainers. Like you mentioned, there's a lack of capacity. Is there, with the farmers you know and work with, also a lack of transition finance? Is there a need for more models to help farmers through that first period? Because maybe not immediately the profitability goes up. Maybe you have to make some investments, like you mentioned. Is that something you're thinking of if you're looking at as General Mills?
Yeah, yes, that's another element of that ecosystem services market, is thinking about how do you ensure that the farmer has support as they are making those changes? Because maybe in year one, they are having to make investments in cover crops, or maybe in year one, they're piloting these practices on, a much smaller set of acres than they would if they had more access to capital to help that transition come about. So I do think that that's a really important place where additional support could come in for those farmers that maybe want to make the leap across more acres or across all of their operations. But if you're a farmer that right now does not have livestock, to think about how do you integrate the livestock and what does that cost, and how do you start caring for the livestock that are now on your operation. So there's all of those elements that still, I think, need to be addressed. And I think we'll learn more as we get further into this pilot to understand what did the farmers identify gaps in support, where else could they use more help, where else, whether it's through the knowledge and the training, or are there other tools or ecosystem services for their own farms that they could use more support with. So I think more of that will be coming, but I do think that transition period is really important for farmers as well. And having a little bit more of a cushion there, I think could make a big difference for a lot of farmers.
Yeah, I've heard some discussions on numbers like $100 an acre, or at least the minimum, like if you're going from row cropping, certain types of soy, etc. Like what would you make on that if that's the cushion that we guarantee that for 3 years, or we guarantee that for 4 years? So at least you are free to experiment and you know that you can eat if everything fails, which usually it doesn't, but you might have one bad year and then you still need to eat.
Right, exactly.
And what has been the response of consumers? Because I've seen pictures, I haven't seen it in person, but I've seen pictures of you putting actually in supermarkets soil matters on actually some promotion material and on the packaging. How have been consumers responding to a much more positive story on food, while they're usually being hammered with, no, you should actually eat less of this and this and this because of the negative impact? Well, what's been the response to that?
I think what we have learned is that consumers are intrigued for sure and really interested to see the brands operating in this way and talking about these regenerative ingredients. But I would say even before that, what I think we're learning is that we can't assume that consumers are very fluent in regenerative agriculture. So we're having to step back and think about, how do you explain the benefits of regenerative agriculture if you can only do it on a macaroni and cheese box or on a cereal box? And so that's learning that we took in from year one, where we did some of this work with our Annie's mac and cheese, where some of the wheat there was from, we were able to source back and put the name of the farm, the farmer's names, the location on the front of the box. And I think the box also had a picture of soil and some images of little bugs, below ground, and biodiversity above the ground. And I'm not sure how well that kind of hit the nail on the head with consumers, but I think that we're learning that it's important how we message and talk about regenerative agriculture. So I would say we're still learning, and we're still looking at bringing additional brands on the journey to be able to talk about this. And I hope that in the next, few years, you see more of our brands talking about this and bringing it to life on pack for consumers to help them understand why this is so important, how powerful regenerative agriculture is, and that, that these ingredients are right here within the box of Cheerios that you're purchasing today, and what that can do, for a consumer to say, wow, with your food choices, the power of you just, within your wallet, making these decisions on what foods you buy, and what that can do for planet and climate in the long run.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of work to do there, especially when you're going into climate positive beef. And we've been hearing so many horror stories about the amount of water and carbon. And I talked to someone in Australia, and I said, yeah, we're talking about grass fed, grass finished. And especially the consumer is quite confused, to say the least, as an understatement. But there's a very interesting, very positive story to tell there. But yeah, it's going to take a bit of time and a lot of storytelling and a lot of good marketing to figure that out.
Agreed. And to think about, it's not like this is very simple. It takes some time to actually explain the concepts and explain the importance, and to explain, the outcomes. And so figuring out how you can very succinctly and creatively and in a visually appealing way get that on a package, I think is what we're working to crack still.
Yeah, and you only have like half a second when somebody takes one Cheerios or one package over another, and you need to make sure you get that message across. I want to be conscious of your time and ask the final question, which usually leads into another final question. But if you could wave your magic wand and tomorrow morning we wake up and you would have changed one thing in the regenerative agriculture, or let's say even the agriculture sector or industry as a whole, and also the food space, what would you change overnight, and what would that be?
I think that I would use my wand to move more acres to regenerative practices globally. And that in turn would be demonstrating to society the benefits that this type of these farming practices can bring for people, for planet, for biodiversity, and to be able to show those outcomes so people understood why this is such an important transition and why this is such an important way for this generation, our generation, to be stewarding the land. Because if we don't make these changes, we will continue to lose topsoil, and it will be harder and harder for us in the long term to feed ourselves and to feed our children and our grandchildren.
I don't think there's a better way to end this podcast. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you for sharing, and I'll definitely be checking in. I think looking at the last few months, the amount of news coming out, that is a good indication for how much you're doing. I think the pilot is extremely interesting. We didn't cover everything, obviously, you're doing because there's so much, but I'll be checking in the future for sure and hope to hear more.
That sounds great. We'll look forward to staying connected, and thanks for having me today.
I hope you enjoyed this interview with Mary Jane on the role of big food companies in this transition. If you found the Investing in Regenerative Agriculture and Food podcast valuable, there are a few simple ways you can use to support it. Number 1, rate and review the podcast on your podcast app. That's the best way for other listeners to find the podcast, and it only takes a few seconds. Number 2, share this podcast on social media or email it to your friends and colleagues. Number 3, if this podcast has been of value to you, and if you have the means, please join my Patreon community to help grow this platform and allow me to take it further. You can find all the details on patreon.com/regenerativeagriculture or in the description below. Thank you so much, and see you at the next podcast. Dear friends of the podcast, I'm super excited to share with you the online video course Investing in Regenerative Agriculture and Food. How to put money to work in regenerating soils at scale and growing a lot of tasty food while doing it. Why are we doing this course? After 100 interviews and more than 100 hours of audio asking the question how to put money to work in regenerating soils, and have been following the space since 2011 and recording these podcasts since 2016, we thought it was time to share our lessons learned. What have we seen in the space over the last years? How have we built our decision-making framework? What to focus on with the podcast? How have we picked interviewees? And what questions should you ask? What is happening in the space? What should you read? What should you listen? What should you watch? How to approach this space? For whom is this course? You, the soil builders and investors in this space. The soil builders, people working in this space, entrepreneurial farmers, fund managers, vehicle builders, crowd investing, platform builders, agtech companies, farm-to-gut food companies, permaculture, keyline designers, holistic management consultants, etc., etc. People that are building soil at scale. And the investors who are putting their own money to work through their family office or as private individuals, or people who are putting other people's money to work through foundations, institutional capital, banks, insurance companies, etc. Is this course free? No. This is pay what you think it's worth. Meaning, I have no way of knowing what this course will be worth to you. And I'm very aware that among the listeners of this podcast, we have people with very different means. So I'm inviting you, if this course is creating value to you, and if you have the means, to consider paying what you think it's worth. Thank you. So what is this course? It's currently a series of 17 videos, mostly ranging from 10 to 15 minutes, plus PDF slides, so you don't have to ride along. We're gonna look into why invest in regenerative agriculture and why extractive agriculture is so risky, how to invest, what kind of frameworks you could and I think should build, what to invest in, what kind of co-investors you could find, or what kind of investors you could find if you're a soil builder. Every lesson will have a digging deeper part where I will share what kind of reports, what kind of interviews, what kind of videos you can look into if you want to dig deeper. We're going to look at nutrient density, landscape design, and a lot more. So what is it not? It's not a list of investable deals. Unfortunately, that doesn't exist in this world. We're really at the beginning of the regenerative agriculture and food revolution. It's also not investment advice. Before making any investment, please find professional investment advice. So get ready, get a cup of coffee, a cup of tea, or whatever you're drinking. Click on the link below, sign up, and I'm really looking forward to your feedback.